All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sue Harmon, and I'm a librarian at the Manchester City Library in Manchester, New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us today for the third part of the Culturally Curious Art Series, George Tooker, Modern Life and Magical Realism, presented by Jane O'Neill. I'm joined by librarians from your hometown. This program was made possible by the combined resources of the GMOC's libraries, and we're very excited to be able to offer educational programs to you. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. This is a webinar, so all attendees are muted. Jane will answer questions at the end of the program, so please use the Q&A for questions. And feel free to use the chat to share your impressions and comments. Make sure that the message is going to everyone and not just the panelists if you want people to join your discussion. The program is also being recorded. In the next few days, you'll receive an email link with a survey with a link to the recording and a survey. Please take a few moments to tell us what you thought of the program. Your responses really do help us. Let us know what types of programs you'd like to see in the future, and you can sign up for your library's newsletter for upcoming programs and library news. Speaking of upcoming programs, please join us at the Manchester City Library on Wednesday, August 9th at 5:30 p.m. for a program on how to save seeds for your garden. UNH Extension Master Gardener Donna Lucier will talk about why saving seeds is important, what kind of seeds to save and when to harvest them, the different methods for processing seeds and preparing them for storage, and several tips and tricks to ensure successful germination. And Michelle has a program to talk about from the Nesmith Library.
Yeah, hi. Welcome, everyone. I'm Maria from the Nesmith Library in Windham, New Hampshire, or Windham, New Hampshire. And a week from today, Thursday, July 6th, we have a New Hampshire Humanities program, Banjos, Bones, and Ballads, with Jeff Warner. And he's going to be telling stories and playing the banjo. And that's at 3 p.m. It's an afternoon program. And anyone above the age of 10 are welcome to attend. No registration required, although you can register if you'd like. So I hope to see you next week at the Nesmith Library in Windham.
Thanks, Michelle. And your presenter today is Jane O'Neill. She curates and delivers art appreciation programs to audiences throughout New England and beyond. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. A New Hampshire native, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the Southern New Hampshire University. For more information, visit iamculturallycurious.com. And that is all I have for introduction. Thank you, Jane, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this. And I'm really excited because I think this is a program that people might be, or an artist, I should say, people might be less familiar with. So I'm so pleased to be the person to introduce you to George Tooker, or to get you a little bit more familiar with him, because I've always just been so enchanted by his paintings. He was a 20th century American artist, and he created these remarkable realist and somewhat surrealist paintings about modern life, and as we'll see, many timeless themes as well. So don't feel bad if you've never heard of him. I feel like he is kind of like America's best kept secret. I am so glad that this program is being recorded, though, because I think after you learn a little bit more about him, you might want to send that link to some of your friends, because these images, I think, are just so compelling. So let's dive right in and get a little bit familiar, or get acquainted at least, with what we'll be looking at tonight, how we'll spend this next hour together. So we have this kind of strange, haunting image on the screen here, and this is an image called Festa from 1948. We don't have the chance to go back to this one and delve a little bit more deeper into it, but I think you can already see kind of the haunting quality of some of his work. George Tooker once actually said, he said, "I am after painting reality impressed on the mind so hard that it returns as a dream, but I am not after painting dreams as such, or fantasy." So we'll see how all this comes together. We're going to start off with an introduction to the artist and just this concept. What is magical realism, or at least in magical realism through the lens of George Tooker? And then we'll focus on his works that really focus on social commentary. They're known as his public paintings. And then I just kind of threw these different categories together based on some of his favorite topics. And I think they work fairly well. Windows and doors, light and love, sleep and death, and then we'll finish up with his legacy. So again, let's just dive right into getting to know George Tooker. Here he is. As a young boy, he was born in 1920 in Brooklyn, New York, and he was raised Episcopalian. His mother was actually half Cuban, and that was pretty important to his identity. He actually thought of himself as a mixed race person, although obviously he could easily pass as a white person. At the age of 7, he started taking painting classes, but his parents always had pretty great aspirations for what he could be in life. So when he was a junior in high school, they had him transfer to Phillips Academy in Andover, and then he went on from there to Harvard. And he went to study literature, but he always wanted to paint. It was like the burning desire inside of him. So when he was at Harvard, I think he was exposed to all of these people of great privilege, of great wealth. And that's when he became very aware of the inequalities that existed in America. And we'll see that becomes a lifelong concern for this artist, and it's often expressed in his art. Tooker was an openly gay man in America at a time when that was certainly not socially acceptable. His sexuality and this sense of sort of being an outsider in America helped to develop this incredible empathy in his art, and it guided the kinds of subjects he chose. Now, after he went to Harvard, he went right back to New York City, and he started studying art at the Art Students League. And one of his, I think one of his teachers that had the most profound influence on him was an artist by the name of Reginald Marsh. And this is an example of his work over here on the right. Marsh was a social realist artist, and so most of his paintings are these kind of gritty scenes of New York City. In this case, we see all of like this flood of people coming off of the subway. We have this terrific sense of movement, all the details of like the women's dresses, all the fashion, and then just to connect it with modern life even further, there's usually always signs and newspapers, multiple newspapers here. So we see George Tooker taking a page from Reginald Marsh, which makes sense. He's studying underneath him. And we have this early sketch from Tooker where he's painting a woman sitting across from him on a subway. She is fashionable. He's capturing all of that, and she's reading the paper. So we already see that influence, but we already see him kind of setting his own path here, because you'll notice the newspaper that he has painted has no information on it. It doesn't really root you in a specific time and place. And that will be a recurring theme when it comes to George Tooker. Now, Reginald Marsh was an influence, but it was actually George Tooker's contemporaries that played a major role in terms of shaping his artwork. So there were two artists, one named Paul Cadmus, whose painting is over here on the left, and then another artist named William Christopher. These three men were very, very close, and they all painted in a similar way. They all painted using a similar medium, and so they had this tremendous impact on each other over the course of many years. So on the left, Cadmus's painting is called The Fleet's Inn. This is from 1934. And when you look at this work, you can see that the figures are more monumental in scale than, say, Reginald Marsh's, who we just saw before. There isn't that same sense of movement. There's a focus on the volume of these figures. And of course, there's almost a sense of sensuality here. You can kind of see through these figures' clothes. And that's something we'll be seeing with Tooker's work. Over here with William Christopher, one of the kind of intriguing things about this painting from 1960 called Red Interior is that you almost get the sense that you're seeing the same figure being repeated again and again and again. We'll also see that Tooker sort of and Christopher kind of shared this composition in several of their works. Now, interestingly, George Tooker was not just friends with these men, he had relationships with them. He dated Cadmus for about 4 or 5 years, and then later began to date William Christopher, or Bill Christopher. And that began in the early 1950s and continued on for decades until William Christopher passed away. So here is George Tooker as a young man. Here's William Christopher in front of him. So they are young men living in New York City. It's the 1950s. They are openly gay, and they're kind of dealing with what the repercussions of that are in modern society. Now, they were the loves of each other's lives, and when it comes to Tucker's painting, I remember reading at one point, an art historian said his works are never explicitly homosexual, but they're kind of implicitly homosexual because of his identity. And so a lot of art historians go straight to this early painting called Children and Spastics from 1946. So Tucker would have only been about 26 years old when he painted this. And this is a scene where we see these 5 children dressed in black, seemingly armed with like spears, but they're really brooms and that sort of thing. And they are kind of taunting and tormenting these very pale, grown men who are also wearing these pale colored clothes. 2 of them have their arms exposed too, so their flesh is kind of exposed more so than the skin of the children. I mean, their faces, some of their faces are even obscured. But what art historians go to in this strange painting is that several of these spastic men are affecting these gestures and mannerisms that might even suggest that they are homosexual stereotypes. So it's really a picture about, perhaps it's a picture about George Tucker and his own life. So we're already seeing how his biography is kind of spilling into his paintings here. Now, this brings us to his remarkable self-portrait from the following year. He's just about 27 years old when he paints this beautiful work, this really striking work. It's in this round format or a tondo format, and he had just gone to Provincetown for the summer and decided to shave his head. So we have this great emphasis on the shape of his head. It's reinforced by the architectural detail here in the background, and of course, the decision to hold up this nautilus shell. This notion of kind of wrapping around something or even kind of supporting the volume of something is further reinforced by the fact that the artist chose to paint himself not only wearing a sweater, but having a sweater draped over his neck and knotted at his collarbone here. So it's an interesting choice, but it's really kind of this play of shapes for the most part. And just to give you a sense of how realistic this work is, this is a photograph of the artist from about the same time. Now, I have to admit, I am just sort of a sucker for this kind of realism. It's really fascinating to me that somebody can do this, especially at such a young age. But I think one of the things we have to remember is that when this was painted in 1947, this kind of realism was on the outs in the art world. Nobody was really interested in it, at least nobody of any sort of significant clout. Jackson Pollock was already creating these non-objective splatter paintings like Full Fathom 5 that we see over here from the same year. So George Tucker, I mean, part of the reason he's not a household name is that he was emerging at a time when his work was really considered kind of unimportant, almost irrelevant, at least in the art world at the time. So he never became a household name, but he never really regretted that. As we go along today, we'll see that he was a man who sort of moved slowly, moved methodically, and almost preferred the life of a hermit than, that of a celebrity. So as we continue on with George Tucker, I think it's important to just note his process here too. We see him as a young man sketching here, and we see a later painting that's in the collection at Dartmouth's Hood Museum. This is just a carton of eggs from the 1960s. And the reason he was painting eggs was because eggs were essential to his paint making process. He was using egg tempera, which was essentially an anachronistic process, of an anachronistic form of painting at this time. Oil paints have existed for centuries now, but he's kind of going way back, looking back at artists who are working in the 1400s, say somebody like Botticelli, and looking at how they built up volume, a sense of volume, and how they use line with this really slow process. Because essentially when you're using egg yolk tempera, I mean, from just cooking that egg yolks can dry out really fast. So you have to kind of go back to it again and again with this kind of methodical process so that your pigments don't dry up. And it's really hard to get a really bright saturated color from egg yolk tempera. So and it's also kind of unforgiving. You make a line and you can't really blend it out. That's why we see this kind of emphasis in line, especially in Botticelli's Birth of Venus with her hair. We have a similar picture from Tooker over here on the right. And I think he was actually thinking of Botticelli when he created this picture. Notice that how the heads are hinged on the neck in the same way and the hair is kind of flying in the same way. So he is using this old-fashioned process, and he's really trying to just develop forms slowly over time with this process that requires you to go back to your gessoed panel again and again and again. Now, he was so methodical in terms of how he made these works. I wanted to show you too that he started with these drawings. I apologize that it's a little bit grainy over here on the left, but it gives you a sense in terms of how he went from drawing to painting. Here he's really accentuating the underlying forms, the underlying geometries, I should say, that organize his pictures. And then he would take a grid and overlay the picture and transfer the drawing essentially to the gessoed panel over here, where then he would start laying in the color. He would work so slowly, and this process really required this kind of deliberate pace, that he would only make about 3 to 4 paintings a year. So he was not prolific. So going back to his life a little bit here, we've got another self-portrait over here on the left. And once again, from this self-portrait, which I think is from the 1980s, we can see that focus on the form and the geometries. Notice how the brush that he paints himself with in the picture creates this lovely V shape right here at the foreground. We've got another wonderful triangular shape created by this light that kind of sets his eyes and that hat off from the rest of the picture. So the content and the composition are always very well thought out when it comes to Tooker, and that creates a great deal of satisfaction, I think, when you start exploring these images. So if we're thinking about his life, let's turn our attention over here to this unusual painting. This is a work that's called Dark Angel, and it brings me to this point about Tooker and his commitment to civil rights, actually, because beginning in the 1950s, he and Bill Christopher began to spend a lot of their free time up in rural Vermont, and then they moved there permanently to as Bill Christopher becomes a teacher at Dartmouth. So while they're living there in rural Vermont, one of the whitest states in the country, they end up joining the NAACP at Dartmouth, and they actually travel to Selma, Alabama to take part in a civil rights march with Martin Luther King Jr. So they're very committed to this, and you'll see that George Tooker is really committed to including people of all races, all genders in his pictures. In this kind of strange image here, he's kind of resting his chin on his hand in this thoughtful manner with the paintbrush still there. And this angel seems to be almost compressing his head, maybe delivering a little bit of divine inspiration, but you might notice the wings in the background and the halo here. So just a quick biographical note on Tooker. His partner in life, Bill Christopher, passes away in 1972, 1973. And Tooker decides he's not going to pursue any other relationships. He's there in rural Vermont. He actually converts to Catholicism shortly after that. And his life is really just about going to church every day and then going home and sketching and maybe doing a little bit of painting. And he lived like this, continued to produce art like this until 2011 when he passes away. So these are two images of the artist, a photograph and a self-portrait from 1985. Now, let's just touch on magical realism before we get to the other bigger themes for today. I just love this comparison here because we've got 3 women versus 3 men, these bright, vivid colors versus this kind of pale picture over here. And these women are so alert. They're watching something, and these men are unconscious. So a great sort of compliment here. So when it comes to George Tooker, his paintings always sort of seem like they're in the modern world, and that usually comes to us from the way that the clothes are cut, but there's also a lack of specificity there. It might feel like the modern world, but you can't really pin it down. Is this the 1940s? Is it the 1980s? You never really know. And then when we're thinking about what makes this kind of surreal or magical realism, it's that lack of specificity once again that that leads us to think that there's something other, something else happening in these pictures, something surreal here. So his style of painting is very realistic. It's close to photographic, but it's certainly not quite there. So in these images, we see him making specific choices. Like, for example, the woman over here, it looks like the same woman replicated 3 times, right? And we almost get the sense, is this, well, it prompts us to ask all these different questions. Like, if this is the same woman replicated 3 times, is this almost like a time-lapse painting? Or perhaps it's 3 sisters. But then even the bigger question, what are they doing there on the floor? What are they so alert and looking for? What is the bigger story here? Well, Tooker never answers it for us. Excuse me, just a moment. And the same is true over here with these men sleeping on the beach. We just don't know how they ended up there. Has it been a wild night at a beach party, or were they in a shipwreck and washed up on shore? We just don't have all of the information or all of the answers. He gives us just enough detail to sort of whet our appetite and get us looking a little bit more closely. Okay. So let's delve into what are, without a doubt, his most famous paintings, his paintings on social commentary. Most of them are from the 1950s, and most of them are in the country's greatest museums. So this is a painting called Government Bureau from 1956. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And here we're in a very bland, bureaucratic, administrative space, right? And we've all been in a space like this before.Maybe it's at the DMV or something like that. Maybe you're going to pay your taxes. And it's this bland space where we can see these through these frosted panels with these tiny round cutouts, the faces of these bureaucrats that look tired, they look exhausted, there are big bags under their eyes. And for a second, we almost feel sympathy with them. But I think Tooker really wants us to feel sympathy with all of these figures that are there waiting to be processed, right? They're just a number in this moment. And these men behind the frosted glass don't necessarily have any incentive to treat people kindly or to deal with their issue efficiently. So Tooker is really creating an image about the misuse of authority without responsibility. And he creates this real sense of dread in this by suggesting that this is almost an infinite space. We don't really know where it ends. And beyond that, there is sort of like an infinite number of people here, and they all sort of look the same. It's like copy, paste over here, and women wearing the same colors and the same shoes and that sort of thing. So it's a dehumanized architectural space and a dehumanizing process. Not surprisingly, Tooker had his own experience that inspired a painting like this. He was renovating a brownstone, had to get all the permits, and it resulted in like weeks of frustration and headaches going to offices where he felt like one of these people. These figures are often called the Tooker man because they so clearly seem inspired by the artist's own likeness. So this next image here is probably his best known painting, and it's called The Subway from 1950. This is in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art. So once again, it's familiar. Probably all of us have stepped on a subway at some point. And if you haven't, you've probably been in a parking garage that feels like this, or like the bowels of some big building where you can't quite navigate it. And it seems a little foreboding. And so this is like the architecture of, well, almost like disengagement. There's this special feeling that happens when you go down into the subway, I think in any major city, where above ground, you might have smiled at people, you might have nodded your head, you might have made eye contact, but you just don't do that in a subway. There is this special kind of fear that separates people and creates this kind of paranoia. And Tooker emphasizes this with this architectural space that he's created, and it's really complicated. He actually uses 3 vanishing points with all of these different corridors here. So we have our protagonist in the front. We can see a face now. We see that she's wearing a red dress, but there's something about her that's a little bit androgynous too, right? I mean, look at the size of that hand there. And she looks especially fearful. Notice the sour faces and expressions on all of these strangers around her, some of these men in these little niches where we can imagine there might be payphones, and they look alarmed. Some people look depressed, distraught. There's no daylight, there's no trains. It's just this endless, complicated maze. And it's, again, it's about this dehumanizing architecture. One of the details I always loved that always sort of terrified me is at the end of this long hallway, right in front of us, there is another woman in red. I can zoom in on her for a second. Here she is way in the back. And she's got this kind of fur stole around her shoulders. And she seems to be sort of squatting against the wall. And strangely enough, she's got what looks like a crown on her head. So she's dwelling in this place where people just move through. Nobody sticks around in a subway. And she seems to be like this queen of the underworld. So very quickly, we can go back and just retrace this to George Tooker's roots as somebody who loved this kind of early Italian Renaissance painting. This is an image by Piero della Francesca here, where we get the sense of these major figures that have all of this volume to them, where you can really get a sense of the mass of these figures, but then also this emphasis on the architectural space and these kind of remarkable shifts of perspective here, or dramatic shift where we have larger figures and then tinier figures in the background. So Tooker's really taking a page from art history to create an image like this, and certainly thinking about the kinds of subjects that his teacher, Reginald Marsh, had advocated for when he was just an art student. But instead of all of that specific detail, the fashion, the newspaper, we get that sense of timelessness with the subway. We don't quite know, is it the 30s? Is it the 40s? Is it the 80s? It all kind of blends together, and it represents the 20th century, right? And this is a brand new kind of experience in the subway in a modern city in the 20th century. I would say that it's an experience that still resonates today. There is a photographer named Paul Vandekar who was recreating the subway painting in a number of photographs just back in 2016, trying to tap into this dread that people had about the direction that the country was going in leading into the election that year. So just a few other examples of these public paintings that Tooker was producing. This one is called The Waiting Room. It's at the Smithsonian. It's from 1959. And this was, again, another image about the bureaucratic process, just feeling like you're waiting to wait. You're not even living your life. And we've all been there, right? I mean, maybe it's in line at security at the airport, or maybe it's in a hospital waiting room. But notice here, he's once again trying to suggest a space that is almost infinite. We see these stalls that are numbered, and we're all the way up above the number 100. How many stalls exist outside of the frame of this picture? We see people exhausted. We see people hunched over. We see people sort of embracing each other, trying to strengthen each other in these little stalls where people seem to be hanging their clothes. We don't know what other purpose they have, but notice that we can't see anyone's full face. Even the figure who's looking out at us, his glasses obscure his eyes. Really, the only face we see is this kind of terrifying grimace on the back of this magazine that's held in front of this woman's face. So there's really nothing about these modern spaces that that Tooker is celebrating. He really is trying to create that same sense of fear and dread that he feels in these spaces. Now, sometimes he makes them even more abstract. This one is just called Landscape with Figures. It's from actually the 1960s. He finished it in 1966. And whenever I look at this picture, I always think, How many of us have ever worked in an office cubicle before? We can all probably relate to this experience on some level. All of these people in this dehumanized architectural space, most of them have their heads bowed. For the most part, we don't even see their eyes, but a few of them look like they're almost sleeping or unconscious or in a different state. But some of them look like perhaps they're starting to have some sort of awakening. As with almost every Tooker painting, we don't see the light source, but there is this kind of creepy light coming in from the left. Believe it or not, a steel company got in touch with George Tooker in the 1960s and asked if they could use this image for employee recruitment. I still can't believe it. George Tooker said no, and he said he didn't want to be a part of the military industrial complex. But at the same time, how many people would apply for a job if this was on the poster? So if this is working in hell right here, this would be what the break room for hell might look like. This is simply called Lunch from 1964. And it is this very compressed break room. We see all of these bodies sort of huddled over these tiny little counters here. And everybody's going out of their way to not look at each other. They don't want to engage. There is something very lonely about eating by yourself, and something lonelier still about trying to not connect with people who are eating very closely to you. So it's a particularly sad, sort of poignant scene whenever I look at it, but there's also a layer that relates to the sort of the world beyond this painting, and that is the fact that right at the center of this picture, the only face that we can see in full is the face of an African-American man. This was painted in 1964 when there were still lunch counters being desegregated all across the American South. So to show an integrated lunchroom like this was like a political statement on the part of George Tooker, and to sort of prioritize the presence of this figure here was certainly a nod to what was happening in the world. We see that as well in this next piece here that's called Supper from 1963. And this doesn't feel like we're in a break room at all anymore. This is another picture about equality and civil rights, but it's a picture that's really inspired by the history of painting. So we have a Black figure at the center of this painting. His hands are resting on bread. He seems to be looking out at us sort of, well, with a sense of peace, almost like a pose of blessing over the bread. And he's flanked on either side by two white men. I would say they're like the Tooker man. But this is a picture that seems to recall the format for many paintings that have been created over the centuries for the scene from the Gospels called the Supper at Emmaus. And this is a scene where the Christ, who has already been crucified, comes back sort of incognito and surprises two of his disciples. And they don't recognize that it's him until he breaks the bread. So in this case, he has shown up in the guise of an African-American man. And that is George Tooker explicitly drawing a connection to Martin Luther King Jr., who he thought of as being particularly peaceful and enlightened in the same way that George Tooker thought of Jesus. So to make a Black Jesus in the 1960s was a pretty unusual choice for the time. All right, so let's turn our attention to the more of his kind of timeless themes, themes that he would go back to again and again, and oftentimes not right in a row. He's only producing a few paintings a year, and he might do one window painting and then switch it up and do something else, and then go back to a window painting years or decades later. So windows tend to be a big theme in his paintings. We know that he made more than 10 paintings about windows, and doors, well, it's just a nice compliment. Okay, so the first window painting I wanted to show you is called Gypsy from 1951. This was definitely inspired by George Tooker's neighborhood in New York City at the time, where he lived on West 18th Street. He passed by a number of these shop fronts that had been converted so that Gypsy women could tell fortunes. And even though this isn't a direct document of one of those shop fronts, it was those experiences informed this painting. So we see this reclining woman. Her feet are up on another chair, her arms are crossed, her eyes, her gaze seems sort of set in the distance. She looks a little tired, a little wearied here. We see these wonderful patterns between the tapestries on the wall and this texture on the walls and ceilings here. But once again, we have this magical George Tucker light where there's this orange curtain hanging in the room, and just ever so vaguely through that curtain, because of this Tucker light, we can see the silhouette of a man standing in profile. And then we begin to wonder about that relationship between this man and this woman. Now, the seated reclining woman is a format that comes to us through the history of art, going back centuries. This is a famous painting from the French artist Jacques-Louis David, who would paint these kind of socialites in Paris. But in this case, he's tapping into this formula of a fully clothed, seated, but with feet up, reclining woman here. And Tucker isn't trying to elevate the status of his subject. Instead, I think he's trying to prompt us to think more about her and her life. Now, if this picture already looks a little bit familiar, the setup here is really familiar, right? We already saw the Bill Christopher painting where the woman is seated in a similar way. We also see a man in the background with a curtain in the distance. This is a picture that came after Tucker's painting. So you can see how these artists are cross-pollinating. Tucker goes back to the subject of gypsies almost 2 decades later, but the paintings are so similar. We once again have a woman in almost identical clothes seated with the same kind of jacket draped over her chair, but now she's looking directly out at us. And there's even another woman who's kind of hanging over the back of the chair. And there is this sense of a no-nonsense confrontation between us and these women. And then that glowing curtain, and this time the man standing behind the curtain is facing the curtain, and we can see his hand hooking around the edge, just about to draw it back. So once again, we're left wondering about all of these relationships. What will we see when the curtain comes away? So Tucker and Bill Christopher, they move to Brooklyn, they renovate this brownstone, and just across the street from them is a boarding house that was owned by a Puerto Rican family. And so it sort of invited in this kind of cross section of the public. And so Tucker, from his own window, could look across the street and see all of these people in the windows of that boarding house who, again, didn't directly inspire painting, but gave him inspiration for the kinds of pictures he wanted to create. And he even says that the window format just lends itself to painting. So in this case, we're looking at a woman who seems to be looking out at us from her window. Imagine doing that in New York City, looking out your own window and seeing somebody who looks kind of exhausted like this, returning the gaze. Notice how one hand is up and sort of supporting her head. She's got these very heavy lids and the sense of just weariness here. Behind her is a shirtless man. He's on the other side of this green curtain that once again is illuminated from an unknown light source. We see his silhouette, and once again, we see that hand coming to pull the curtain away, or the shade away, I should say. There are these red curtains here too, which really complement her tank top. Her hand and the way that wrist is bent, I think, beautifully complements the hand of the man just above her too. And if you were to just kind of dissect this picture in terms of a graph, I mean, she's in the lower right hand quadrant, he's in the upper left. There's a great balance there. But then Tucker also needs to add in a little something extra. Doesn't want to make it so strictly formal. We've got this other figure in the room. He's also shirtless. We don't know his relationship to these other figures. It keeps us guessing. So this was window number 1. Here we have window number 2. This is the image we started with today. It's the same idea, but now we're in the light of day. We see this dark-skinned man pulling back the screen curtain, looking down from his window. And it's this kind of beautiful, serene scene. Our eyes are drawn to the reds and the oranges of this still life on the windowsill just below him. And then you spend a little time just gazing at the beauty of the way this has all been painted. And then you notice this kind of haunting face that's peering out from the shadows, this face that it only sees us because of the way that this man has pulled the curtain back. We don't know their relationship. We don't know what they've been doing, but we do get the suggestion of some sort of sense of intimacy between them. And Tooker is a good one for giving us these intimate scenes as though seen through a window. So this is a picture called Guitar from 1957. And we get the sense that we're peeking into the window of two lovers. One of them has passed out, and one of them has just woken up and is gently strumming his guitar here and smoking a cigarette. And of course, the compositional device is that the woman's torso is meant to complement the shape of that guitar here. So we've got this gorgeous red curtain. It's highlighted or recalled here with these little ribbons from the guitar strap that even drape over the edge of the windowsill here. This is a trompe l'oeil element or a fool the eye element. Apparently George Tooker's gallerist or his representation said, everybody loves those trompe l'oeil elements, keep doing those. So this sense of voyeurism certainly feeds into these pictures, and I think it's important to note here too, we're looking at a scene of an interracial couple. Tooker was doing this at a time when, in many states in the country, it was still illegal for interracial couples to even marry. So he's pushing against these boundaries ever so slightly. I mean, and these weren't paintings that were like, on the national news per se, but in his own kind of private way, he's doing that. And beyond interracial couples, he's even thinking about homosexual couples here. So in that same window format that we've seen before, we see the intimacy of these two couples here. I love the way their arms and these gestures are kind of reinforcing the shapes of the frames of the windows here. But once again, it's pretty unusual for an artist to be creating these kinds of intimate scenes at this point in US history. Now, these two men over here on the right, I want to just highlight them for a moment because George Tooker really never met a torso he didn't want to paint. And there's kind of a connection back here in art history to the way that the martyr, Saint Sebastian, has been painted over the years. Saint Sebastian was a Christian martyr who was sentenced to death by a firing squad of archers. So you oftentimes see him tied to a tree with arrows sticking out of a very idealized torso. So just the notion of suffering, the slings and arrows of modern society and the idealization of his body has made Saint Sebastian a little bit of a gay icon. So we see that same kind of pose in George Tooker's paintings that we see in a lot of depictions of Saint Sebastian. So we see the intimacy that is suggested through these window paintings. Let's turn our attention now to doors, because for George Tooker, the windows provided this access and the doors are these barriers. And we're going to see how this works, beginning with this picture from 1953 that's simply called Doors. And here we're already, almost overwhelmed with the questions of what's happening here. First of all, critics even said this architectural space doesn't make sense. And I think for a lot of people that probably makes a nice connection back to one of George Tooker's contemporaries, and that would be Edward Hopper. This is his famous painting, Rooms by the Sea, from just 2 years earlier. The quintessential depiction of an architectural space that doesn't quite make sense, but it's all about doors and light. And we can see that playing out in Tooker's painting over here. But we do see this semi-nude figure who's coming through the door. We don't really know who she is, what she's doing, but through the next door, we see another semi-nude figure who is seated, also has these accents of red. And then the third door is just cracked open just a little bit, and this light is flooding into the scene. So in this moment, the doors are providing or suggesting different kinds of access, but the doors very quickly become this barrier. Sometimes they almost function like this wall. And in this picture that's called The Voice, we see two almost identical men on either sides of this door, seemingly trying to communicate. The man on the left is in shadow, his mouth is open. We get a sense of urgency in his face. And then we see his counterpart over here on the right, who is in the light, and he is carefully sort of pressing his ear against this door to hear this message. Now, he looks curious, maybe a little bit frightened. Every time I look at this, I feel like it's almost the setup from a scary movie. You're going to hear some whisper from beyond, and it's going to have some kind of scary message in it, right? So Tucker doesn't tell us what this man is going to hear. He doesn't tell us what the voice is going to sound like on the other side of the door, but he does go back to this composition several times. This is called Voice 2 from 1972. And in this case, he has made his protagonist African American. He's made the figure in the shadows, I think, even a little bit more desperate. He's compressed the space, and he's made his protagonist look a little bit more alarmed by what he's hearing. He's also kind of drained the whole picture of any color here. He continues on with doors, and even when there isn't another figure on the other side of the door, we still get the sense that there is a voice and that these figures are grappling with the message from that voice. So on the left, we have a painting called The Door from 1970. This is at the New Britain Museum of American Art. And this man is sort of forlornly barricading this door with his hand, with his shoulder, with his arm. And the expression on his face is just so melancholy. It's like, even though he's trying to prevent this figure or a message from coming through, the message has already been received. On the right, we see a figure who almost seems traumatized by what he's heard. He's holding himself here. He's gazing off into the distance. We just can't quite make sense in terms of what's happening in that picture, but within the context of the whole series, it seems as though he has heard something. Now, this next image is a little bit disturbing, but it seems like a natural progression here. Now the door is the barrier to the great beyond. And we get the sense that we're looking at two figures here, one of them alive and one of them this kind of skeletal, ghoulish figure who has maybe already passed on. This is a picture called The Lesson from 1974, and it seems as if that ghoulish figure is kind of shrieking a message to those that are still alive. This woman is sort of an androgynous figure, but this woman is pulling back into the shadows, and she is kind of internalizing this message or this scream or this lesson in this moment with a sense of apprehension and fear. We also have this beautiful kind of cascade, this arc of what almost looks like a red funerary wreath here. So we don't know the lesson. We don't know if this is a picture about the dead, or is this a figure who's talking to her former self or just to someone in general. But Tucker leaves it up to us to fill in these blanks, and I think once again, seeing these pictures all together in a series, I think it sort of helps you understand what he's getting towards. So the doors no longer serve as a barrier after a while. They become places of grief. They become places of isolation. So we see this woman who is pressing herself up against this wall or this door here on the left, and we see almost the same figure over here on the right in just a painting called Standing Figures. So here on the right, Tucker has once again created a space that seems infinite, this architecture that goes on and on and on. And each of these figures has their own little wall or their own little box, and they are there, and they and their eyes are closed, and perhaps they are grieving, perhaps they've already passed on. So it's maybe not surprising to you that he takes it one step further. This is the last of our doors series, and the doors have fully transformed into tombstones at this point. This is a picture that's simply called Landscape with Figures 2 from 1966. And each of these doors now serves as a grave marker with a grave in front of it. And these figures are rising up in this kind of greenish, otherworldly light. And some of them, it's a moment of revelation. Some of them it's a moment of reunion. And for some, it's a moment where they're still grieving. And we see that pose replicated here several times. So for Tooker, it's an opportunity. The door is an opportunity to explore some of the most significant divisions in life. And I think it's just so fascinating to see how he progresses this theme over time. So with our time, with our limited time here, we're going to sort of fly through light and love, because light is so beautiful, but he doesn't probe such challenging subjects when he's looking at light. He's really just playing with the medium and exploring just how bright and saturated he can make his colors. So we're looking at Jukebox here from 1953, and we've got this beautiful kind of crisscross element to the jukebox itself that is replicated in the crepe paper, but he is having fun kind of suggesting or exploring the way this woman would have been illuminated from below by this jukebox. Now, even though we associate the jukebox with dancing, with music, with having a good time, once again, it's another image of stillness, of quiet, of people. In particular, he really likes to paint these women who are kind of gazing out. They're almost seer-like, they are hyper aware of their surroundings. He also explores lights with these beautiful Japanese lanterns. This image over here on the right is actually called Garden Party, but you don't get a sense of anything festive happening. Certainly it seems like some kind of celebration, but once again, it's a solemn occasion. Even though you have the glow of these beautiful lanterns, the faces are serene. There's a quietness to these scenes. And there's certainly all these other artists over the years that have painted Japanese lanterns like this, Maxfield Parrish and John Singer Sargent, but Tooker makes these paintings sort of otherworldly. He really focuses on the glow. One of his favorite artists was the artist Georges de la Tour, a Baroque artist. And here you can see this focus from de la Tour on the illumination of the Christ child here. There's a candle behind this woman's hand. Notice how her hand sort of arcs to cover that light. Notice how the Virgin Mary's head is bent down. You get a similar composition here with the way this hand is kind of cradling the lantern, and you have this bowed head up above. So he's using art history, he's using these the beauty of these lanterns to really kind of pull together these disparate things that he's interested in. But we do see some images about love, and I think these pictures are just so moving. These are two versions, vertical and horizontal paintings, called The Embrace, and I think significantly these are images that are set in the great outdoors with these rolling mountains in the distance, these really heartfelt embraces in both paintings. Notice how in each image you can't see the man's face, but you can see the woman's face, and it's sort of tilted back at this unusual angle. It reminds me a great deal of one of the most famous kisses of all time, Gustav Klimt's kiss from 1907, where the woman's head is sort of at this sort of perpendicular angle from her shoulder. So we see something similar in Tooker's composition. He continues on with the theme. He makes it more abstract. Here we see the man's face. We see the hands of each of these figures kind of wrapped around and curving up around each other's bodies. In this case, that rolling landscape now becomes like a blanket around them. And we see how heartfelt and how earnest the expressions are of these figures. I always wonder, is this the embrace that he's been dying to feel, or is there some sadness here because maybe he knows that it's going to be the last time he embraces her? Tooker goes on with this theme in a number of different directions. I just wanted to show you one last iteration here. Now the couple's lying on the ground. There's the blanket that envelops them, and there's that same wonderful sense of you know, now requited love in the face of this man here. But this embrace is just so tight and so tender and so heartfelt here. It's just gorgeous. Now, these figures lying down on the ground provide a nice, easy segue to our last section here. We are looking at sleep and death, and we're going back to the guitar here for a moment, another kind of window theme. It's just to emphasize for you that in the history of art, artists have to kind of make it clear when somebody's sleeping or when they're dead. And a classic way to do this, literally going back to classical antiquity, is to put your arm over your head like this, and then your viewers know that your figure is just sleeping here. Nobody who's dead has their arm like that. Now, it's a little bit more ambiguous over here on the right, but because this sleeping figure is in bed with a nude figure, we know that they're asleep and not dead. But Tooker begins to play with that relationship. We see almost the same setup here, a head that's just kind of like ensconced in linens and pillows here. And now alongside them, a clothed figure who's sort of watching, gazing off into the distance. Are they in mourning? We don't quite know the relationship here. And we really can't tell, is this figure dead or alive, asleep, or in the great beyond. So he plays with this kind of visual riddle quite a bit. This is an image called Sleepers 2 from 1959. It's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And even though they're sleepers, of course, they all have their eyes wide open. Some of them seem in awe, some of them seem a little bit unsettled, but once again, they're almost disembodied. We know there are bodies underneath there, but they're swathed in these white draperies, and it's just these heads. So we don't know if they're sharing a dream, if they're sharing a nightmare, or if this really is just eternal sleep. Now, Tooker revisits this subject of sleep and the ambiguity of sleep and death here with a series of pictures that he created in the early 1960s when his own mother passes away. I think he makes these images a little bit more clear, though. Once again, they're set in the outdoors, where for him, that's clearly where love kind of resides. And we see this man in mourning alongside a sleeping or deceased woman in each of these images. So sort of like the embrace that we saw before, it's like the natural setting speaks to the most heartfelt, most connected feelings that exist for him. So we're going to sort of wrap up with one of his most wild images, and it's one of his earliest. He painted this when he was just 26 years old. It's called The Dance, and it's really the dance of death, right? So we see that the sidewalk has been ripped open in this cityscape here. This shrouded skeletal figure and another one in the distance have emerged from the underworld, and they are here to torment the people who are not living their lives well. So we have a literal dance. Look at the composition here. We've got this wonderful X that's created by the limbs of these figures, and they are being they're being chastised by death here. But notice how really nobody else in the picture seems to be aware of this giant skeleton, save for perhaps this kind of creepy looking woman who is facing us directly. She's sort of a callback to that creepy woman that we saw in the subway. So there's a lot to get into with dance that I'll just set aside for tonight because we're running a little bit late. But I wanted to show you an uncropped version of the picture. I couldn't find one in color, but the uncropped version gives us just one last figure over here on the margin of the painting, and that is George Tooker himself. So we see him here just casually walking down the street, maybe aware of death, maybe not. Just very quickly, one last series that he did, it's a Vanitas theme, and that's a traditional art historical theme about really the brevity of life and the absoluteness, the certainty of death. And so oftentimes that's been suggested through painting beautiful things and this notion that beauty fades. So we see this beautiful young woman contemplating her own reflection. She even has some pearls here to accentuate her beauty. But one more rounded form there is the skeletal face. Is she aware of it? Is she not? But we have that suggestion that the beauty will fade. He develops a whole series about this. Sometimes there's a skeleton, sometimes there isn't. In this case, there's just the rose, and some of the petals have started to fall off the rose. So as she gazes at herself in this mirror, it's this certainty that all beauty will fade. And so really kind of the last iteration of this series, we have a different young woman gazing at her reflection in the mirror. And there's an older woman who is peeking over her shoulder. And you don't quite know if it's a real woman or if it's, you know, the young woman, our protagonist here, sort of aware of who she might turn into. Maybe it's her mother, maybe it's her grandmother, but it is a reminder to us as viewers that this young woman, her beauty will fade, and that all of us will grow older. Finally, Tooker just puts himself in the series too, with the skeleton sort of looming behind him here. He's got a little bit of an uncertain smile. Before he was kind of casually encountering death, and now death has snuck up right behind him. So we'll wrap up very quickly with Tooker's legacy. He passed away in his home in Vermont in 2011. He was 90 years old at the time. And over the course of this 70-year-long career that he had, he created, I think, less than 175 paintings. So slow and steady was the way of George Tooker. We can see him here receiving the National Medal of Arts in 2007 from George W. Bush. He also had several major museum retrospectives in the US before he passed away. But just to sort of encapsulate his legacy with this one last image, I'll just say Tooker was an artist who used these luminous colors and light to illustrate how people should act towards each other, and oftentimes painted the consequences of what happens when they don't. He pushed boundaries on topics that were important to him, including social justice and equality, and he did it in his often understated ways. He remains one of the most distinct, one of the most underappreciated American artists of the 20th century. So thank you for sharing your evening with me, getting better acquainted with George Tooker. And it is my pleasure to start looking at the Q&A and the chat here. It seems like people have had a lot of questions. I see Judith has asked, was the surface he painted on a wooden panel? And he would paint on gessoed panels. So I think there's some texture to them. I hope that answers your question. Let's see, going to the chat, let's see. Looks like this has sparked a little bit of conversation, which I love. We already see people sort of connecting with the sense of anxiety and dreams. That's that magical realism. Yes, all the way. And yes, I would agree that a lot of these images are very creepy. Susan Hart says at one point, there's no way out. I'm sure that she's thinking about the subway in that moment. Lucy said there's a silent movie, The Crowd, that has rows and rows of workers at desks in an office, dehumanizing the workers. And it's such a modern notion, right? We can't really, in my mind, I can't really conjure up images that were created in the world of fine arts that really speak to that experience. And it's an almost universal experience, right? All these great comments along the way. I so appreciate that people were really engaging with these images. Patricia, I know exactly what image you were looking at when you said Gollum, going back to the doors. Very striking images. And I really appreciate that, that you're responding to them, because I think that there's a lot to share here. All right, I see a question here from Margaret. She says, were all of these wonderful paintings were done with egg tempera? He had amazing patience. All of them were. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Most of his, a lot of his body of work went to Dartmouth, the Hood Museum, the Addison at Phillips Academy. So there's a lot of local work, and his estate is managed by a gallery called the DC Moore Gallery out of New York City. So if you wanted to see more, you can see some locally. let's see, Mishi Bell says, so his earlier paintings shown today were more creepy, for lack of a better word, on short notice. Is this because he was younger? Is there any sign his subject matter changed to be more commercially viable? Or is there another reason for this? Are there similar creepy works from his later career? That's a really good question, Mishi. And maybe the creepiness comes from the fact that he was living in New York City and he felt really anxious about living there. And I mean, he was pretty upfront with that in interviews too. He's like, I just didn't like to be there. And so eventually when he moves to Vermont, he can still kind of synthesize the same themes, but they're a little bit more toned down because he's not walking around with that same kind of anxiety. But I think you hit on like a really important distinction as we're looking at his work. So yeah, those public paintings from the beginning definitely have the creepy factor. Yeah, and his fascination with death, certainly. Oh, that kind of creepiness. Well, yes. So he created a number of these strange images, the dance of death, and the children and the spastics that are kind of set in these city settings, right? And after he moves away, his paintings don't seem as charged, and they don't seem like these allegories for modern life quite in the same way. So I really appreciate you picking up on that and like making that point. Judy, thanks for your kind words. Patricia, you too. If anybody wants to get a little bit better acquainted with George Chooker too, this book has been kicking around my house for years. Thomas Garver's book, beautifully illustrated. One really heartbreaking element to it, I think it was published in the early 1990s, and I was just going through it with a fine-tooth comb in preparation for the program. And even back then, they were referring to his, like, the love of his life as just his friend, even though he was like an openly gay man for most of his life. So I think that, to me, that really emphasized, just how difficult it was to be a gay man in the 20th century. So there's some really heartbreaking aspects of his life too. Okay, I think I got to all of these questions. Sue, Maria, if I missed anything, please let me know. And for anybody who sort of wants to stay in touch or talk a little bit more about George Chooker, please feel free to be in touch with me at iamculturallycurious.com. There's a contact me section on the website. So I always love to hear from people when it comes to this sort of thing.
Thank you so much, Jane. I think you got all the questions in the chat that I saw. Lisa asked if the recordings for past events are available, and they are available through Manchester, or if you're from one of the libraries in the GMOX consortium that have joined this program, they have the recordings of this series. But you can also email me at the Manchester Library at library@manchesternh.gov. I'll put that in the chat.
And then also we have Jane back on July 20th to talk about Norman Rockwell.
Yes, we have several.
That's going to be a very different program. A lot less death. That's going to be really light and really fun because it's Norman Rockwell really painting about art. There's a surprising amount of his body of work that is talking about art. And I think people think of him as like this chronicler of middle-class life in the 20th century. And really, he's just painting about himself in a lot of ways. So it's really fun to take it apart.
All right. I think that's all. I'll let you all get back to your evenings. Thank you again, Jane, so much for joining us. And I hope to see you all at the next program on, what was it, July 20th?
July 20th, yeah.
Cool. See you then. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Take care.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Happy
Bye.
4th if you're in the States.